Yeah, we know. Alright folks, we're nearly there. Here we are at the very end, at the fourth and final part of the world building review of the Wizarding World of Harry Potter. If you haven't seen the rest, definitely go check them all out, cause trust me, you're going to need it to get the full context here. And while you're at it, don't forget to click the subscribe button and help turn this channel into pure magic. With that said, let's not waste any more time and jump right into it. Continuing with ghosts. So, I have the same issue with ghosts as I have with paintings as mentioned in the previous video. Namely, if ghosts are a real thing, and it's absolutely possible to interact with them at any time, how are these people not talking with all of the dead? And look, I know, there's the official answer, which is the one every ghost story ever has, and that is, they turn to ghosts if they die leaving something in life unfinished. Sure. Bro, come on! Do you even know how vague that is? What even counts as unfinished? Like, okay, it's one thing if you didn't avenge the murder of your beloved or whatever, and so you'll linger as a ghost until that deed is done. But does unfinished also count for you not finishing your homework assignment? Or not finishing your triple-decker cheeseburger before you have a heart attack and die? No one leaves everything finished before their death. So the world should be invaded by ghosts all the damn time. So yeah, no, I absolutely do not buy that. Also because, again, why didn't James and Lily Potter come back as ghosts or Dumbledore? I mean, okay, to be fair, we can even say that the Avada Kedavra is a spell that's so absolute regarding death that it straight up prevents you from coming back as a ghost no matter what. The only exception might be the Priori Incantatem because it's a very situation-specific spell, and the Resurrection Stone because it happens to be an all-defying Deathly Hallow. But what about everyone else who dies? How come they don't come back? Can there be some other explanation? Actually, perhaps there can be after all, and a clue can be found exactly with the Resurrection Stone. See, in the Deathly Hallows book, when Harry uses the stone to bring back his parents, Sirius and Lupin, and has to go face Voldemort on his own in the Dark Forest, the ghosts he brought back actually fend off Dementors that are still roaming around during the Battle of Hogwarts. Kind of weird to imply that, considering that Dementors are known to suck so much joy out of you that they can legit devour your soul, and the only thing that can block these things are Patronuses. So, why aren't the ghosts sucked in? Heck, if you think about it, they're not even under threat in Prisoner of Azkaban. Shouldn't they be terrified that they'll be devoured by the Dementors? Well, as you might have guessed, I think that ghosts are actually not that different from a Patronus. What if, instead of needing to have some vaguely defined unfinished business to become a ghost, a person becomes one by actually braving death and willingly accepting it? It's something that's incredibly hard to do, and I'm sure extremely few people in the world have ever accomplished that, since death is the ultimate fear that we all have, especially when at its gates. So, if someone were to embrace it fully, instead of going to the afterlife, they remain on Earth eternally as a ghost, and since there was no fear upon death, their incorporeal form could be entirely composed of positive magic so similar to that of a Patronus that it can even fend off Dementors. And to be clear, they'd have to be fully unafraid, not just for themselves, but for others. One of the few downsides, besides the obvious not being able to enjoy corporeal pleasure anymore trope, could also be that they'd have no knowledge of the afterlife. They wouldn't be able to learn too much else from their death onwards, otherwise they'd be incredibly wise sages to always consult the older they get, and the shock of death could still be such that they don't have much memories of it and can't even describe it to the living. Although I admit that this doesn't fit the billing with the origin of, say, the ghosts of Hogwarts, but it's honestly the only solution I could find. So their stories would have to be tweaked as well. The canonical story for Nearly Headless Nick, for example, is that apparently, in life, he tried straightening the teeth of one Lady Grieve and instead made her grow a tusk, and he was sentenced to death for this.
Yeesh, guys, chill!
Had his wand taken away so he couldn't do any tricks, and was beheaded with a blunt axe that didn't fully sever him, hence why he's nearly headless. Like, okay, come on, this is pretty ridiculous as a reason to become a ghost, so at most I'd say that he had to commit some other more serious crime that did deserve execution, but actually did repent so much that he actually willingly embraced death, and ironically it turned him into a ghost so he'd spend the rest of his death repenting eternally until he'd become the much more noble character that we all know and love. The Fat Friar, since he was religious, could have had so much faith despite his knowledge of magic that he just didn't fear what lied beyond the grave. Moaning Myrtle died because of the basilisk stare, true, but since it was such a particular creature, we can say that it was so sudden that she didn't have enough time to experience the fear of death at all, and as mentioned before, ghosts wouldn't be able to remember well the details of how they died anyway. So Moaning Myrtle not remembering clearly what actually happened to her makes sense. And as for the Lady Grey and Bloody Baron, look guys, I got nothing here. Not because it's impossible to come up with a theory, you can come up with whatever you want, but quite frankly the origins of how they both died are insanely messed up. I don't even want to mention them because I don't want YouTube to give me trouble, so look them up yourself if you want, but frankly it's baffling that their origins were what they were and that they're still both together in the castle, so I just reboot their whole story altogether. Yeah, sorry, but that's a nope for me. Anyway, yeah, that aside, I think that this can help explain how ghosts are formed without making it easy to assume that they would appear always. But speaking of ghosts, it's time to address one of my other big complaints on the rules of this franchise. So let's switch to Godric's Hollow. Now, before we get into the solution of this, let's get into the problem first. We know that Harry survived because of the power of love, since his mother sacrificed herself for him. It was so powerful that it bounced the killing curse back to Voldemort and destroyed him. I was going to complain about how it's absurd that Voldemort didn't die from this before, considering all the people who must have sacrificed themselves to protect their loved ones across history, but there is actually a canonical explanation for that. See, this ancient love protection spell has a few steps. First, we have the attacker attacking the target, and the protector stepping in the way. We got that so far. But then, the attacker has to give the opportunity to the defender one chance to step aside. If the defender refuses, then the spell is activated, and even the Avada Kedavra can bounce back. Voldemort just never ever gave the chance for someone to step aside because he's so heartless. It was just this one time, and one was enough for his downfall. Alright, cool, that is a little better. But how has this never happened ever before? Harry's the sole survivor of the curse in all of wizarding history. Are you seriously telling me that not a single person ever willingly sacrificed themselves to an attacker to protect another person over the course of millennia? Yeah, no, I don't buy it. There has to be some other explanation. And it turns out, I think I have an explanation for this. And it all has to do with the location of where that fateful night took place. Godric's Hollow. For those of you who don't know, Godric's Hollow is, yes, a town named after none other than Godric Gryffindor himself, because this is supposedly the same place where he was born, and being such a famous wizard in his time, this small town took his name. But see, I did some research, and it turns out that while we know about where he was born and we know about his greatest deeds, there is no information as to how and where he died. It remains a mystery to this day. So, I propose that Godric's Hollow isn't just where he was born, but also the place where he was buried, regardless if witches and wizards are aware of this. What does this have to do with the night Harry survived? Well, remember when I said earlier that perhaps King's Cross Station actually held some ancient magic in its soil left behind from the last battle of Queen Boudica? What if we applied the same logic here? If Gryffindor did indeed die in Godric's Hollow, and his body is buried there somewhere, then perhaps, since he was such a powerful wizard, even in this case, some small amount of his own magic, and especially spirit, lingered on. And by the way, I'm not saying that he's a ghost, mind you, because that would have been very obvious for everyone, but perhaps when he died, he felt a mix between embracing death — his whole fame and house was based on how brave he was after all — but also some sense of remorse on how he still couldn't reconcile once again with his best friend Salazar Slytherin. And being so powerful, due to these conflicting emotions, his spirit is the only one who remained not in the afterlife, not on Earth, but vaguely in between. And if so, then perhaps his very presence, could have helped create a strong positive force to the chaos magic surrounding the area ever since. So, on the night Harry survived, this semi-force of Gryffindor could sense the danger befalling Lily and James Potter. Yes, this love magic did exist in the past, but to make it more balanced, frankly, it should only work in its specific way in the form of a light magical protection. Just enough to survive basic magical attacks. The Avada Kedavra curse, however, is a very different beast to handle though. It's far too deadly for any regular protection spell at all. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so unforgivable. So, the event happening in Godric's Hollow ended the way it did because Gryffindor's looming spiritual force sensed that not only was happening to a fellow ex-Gryffindor student worthy of being protected for their bravery, but it was all because of the sudden danger of none other than Lord Voldemort, aka the one sole heir of Salazar Slytherin, even more heartless than the original founder, this time with absolutely no redeeming qualities. And thus, Harry survived because Lily, who still died because there's only so much this situation could salvage, accidentally created a love protection spell that was fueled to a degree that had never been seen before by Gryffindor's lingering magic in the area, so much so that even the unstoppable, unforgivable Avada Kedavra wasn't powerful enough, and it bounced back to Voldemort, killing him. The one time this could have ever happened, because all these one-of-a-kind pieces and situations were put in place. And look, I know, this does sort of thematically steal away the sheer important sacrifice Lily made for her son, but I'm sorry, it just can't make sense that her situation alone could have never happened before in the history of ever, no matter how few wizards there have been. There has to be some extra reason as to why Harry is the first and only in history to survive this kind of attack and make his situation this special, because a loving sacrifice isn't that rare of an occurrence. It just doesn't make sense otherwise. If nothing else, however, if there absolutely has to be a reason, I figured this is still as good as any, and can still fit with the way this entire world and history works. And now, folks, after everything we've said so far, it's time to at long last come to the conclusion of these series of videos by talking about the final missing piece of the puzzle of the world building of the wizarding world, and that is none other than the afterlife. That's right, the greatest element that even witches and wizards still haven't figured out to this day. And yet, we keep seeing glimpses of this through the series, specifically in the form of Harry seeing Dumbledore in that strange limbo at the end, the Deathly Hallows themselves, and most importantly, the one object that to this day remains the greatest unresolved mystery in the franchise, aka the veil inside the Ministry of Magic. To this day, no one knows the origin of this thing. We don't know who made it, how it was made, what is the point of it, why it only goes to one side, if it even is confirmed that it goes to the afterlife, cause, there's no way of telling cause you can't come back from it. It's just a complete mystery and we know little to nothing about it, except for one interesting detail. See, it turns out this archway wasn't actually brought inside the ministry itself. Instead, it was found in this very location, and the ministry instead was built all around it. This is actually really interesting, as it means that it's definitely a very old artifact, and if it really is this thing that can't be moved, it makes sense that the ministry, which also functions as a magical research facility by the way, would be built around it, including keeping its departments of mysteries right at hand to fully study it. But at the same time, I found yet another interesting fact. This isn't the only building to be built around a magical artifact. The same applies, ironically enough, to Hogwarts itself. And the object in question was none other than the pensieve, supposedly found half buried into the ground in the location where the four founders built the castle. Again though, with no explanation as to who made it, how it got there, etc. Now, before I continue, I want to clarify that what I'm going to propose from here on out is purely speculative and is very open to modification, so feel free to discuss this in the comments below. But with that said, I think I have a theory as to what all of this might mean. I think that the Veil and the pensieve might also be Deathly Hallows as well. And yes, I know of course that the timeline doesn't exactly add up with all their creations, so I'm open to the idea that perhaps the three brothers and whoever else made these remaining objects were different people. Hell, maybe the brothers found blueprints a long time ago of whoever made the Veil and the pensieve, and it sparked their idea to create the Hallows that we know. It's not like their tale in The Beetle and the Bard was an actual fact, as even Dumbledore suspected they were actually just three particularly gifted wizards who just created these things. Alright, cool. But regardless who actually created all of them and when, the purpose for each one of these creators was still the same. Not only to have full mastery of death, but to also have full understanding of it. If you think about it, we know the stone sort of brings people back from the dead. The one is the most powerful one of all, although we'll get back to that one in a second, and the cloak makes you invisible, yes, but also protects you from death. That much we know. In that case though, the Veil might have been built on purpose centuries ago as a gateway to reach the afterlife in the most painless way possible, specifically because, as mentioned before, it was meant to understand death, except that the problem is that it ended up being a one-way trip. And the pensieve? Well, I think it was built specifically to be the ultimate memoir. A way to leave behind traces of your life and experiences literally in the most immersive way possible, in ways no book or audio or video or whatever can, for others to learn from said memories before passing on to the other side. Dare I say, a way for your experiences to live on after death. And heck, at this point, just for flair, I might even add yet another secret Deathly Hallow, and that could be none other than the Goblet of Fire. Because it turns out, no one actually knows the origins of this either, who made it, when, or what its true purpose was. And all we know it to do is spit out papers of people who will participate in the Triwizard Tournament. But what if it was created specifically to read the quality of your soul? If it can choose the most worthy out of the contestants for the tournament, an event where you might actually face death and you're doing so willingly, I think it might as well have that function in general, to judge who you really are as a person far more effectively than the sorting hat even. So much so, it can even judge if you're worthy of actually seeing beyond death and know if you're capable of surviving and knowing what lies behind the veil. Plus, let's face it, don't you think that it's kind of suspicious that the fourth book is called the Goblet of Fire despite the goblet being, well, not that present or important in the story itself? It would have made much more sense to call it Harry Potter and the Triwizard Tournament, But no, it's specifically titled the Goblet of Fire, almost as if we're supposed to pay particular attention to it. Kinda sus if you ask me, but it would make sense if, indeed, it was meant to be a Deathly Hallow all along. One of 3 different hollows that, even if built at different times, together have the same purpose. So, with all these pieces in mind, we have a clearer picture. These were created over time by a number of wizards to find out the ultimate truth of the afterlife, and we can now create a timeline here. First, the pensieve was created by someone as a way to leave an account of their life. When it was found, it could have been used by many people who in turn could have been humbled by the wisdom of those who came to pass. Maybe even the founders were humbled by this enough to decide to build Hogwarts there. Plus, let's face it, books were around in medieval times for memoirs, but they weren't that common. And then people would have been inspired by all the wisdom of these memories to create the Veil and officially see what lies beyond death. The Veil, however, ended up being a one-of-a-kind trip no matter what they did, and its creation was such an affront to our reality that, once you've opened it, you can't close nor destroy it anymore, maybe not even move it, as a constant reminder that death is always there waiting for you, and thus the ministry was built around it to better study it. And at this point, the goblet's creation could be thrown in anywhere in this timeline, possibly because wizards thought that only the worthy could pass, and they figured they could create an object who could judge the most worthy, but the problem is that no one was. It's just far too big a reality and truth to find out, and since it was deemed useless, it got repurposed to judge the Triwizard Tournament later on. Centuries later, the 3 brothers could have done a lot of research on these previous Hallows and, with their particular talents, created the actual Deathly Hallows that we know of, and at this point, there could have been other reasons for their creations. The stone could have actually been meant to communicate with the dead to gather as much information as possible on what to expect ahead of time before crossing the Veil, even if the time frame for ghosts to appear was short. And this is something that could have been of use, because as we mentioned before, regular ghosts stuck in the mortal world wouldn't remember anything about the afterlife or even their death, but the brothers figured the ones who didn't come back as ghosts perhaps might know. And it turns out they were right. Because when Sirius's ghost was brought back by Harry, he reassures his godson that dying is
quicker than falling asleep.
So he does know this theory that the brothers had did actually work. Although, of course, I don't blame Harry for not taking the opportunity to ask more info about the afterlife, cause, you know, he was kinda occupied with other worries at the time and had a lot on his plate. So I'll give him a break. Anyway, then we have the Elder Wand, which is the most powerful wand of all, but it's never actually exactly quantifiable as to how powerful it is, ain't it? Like, can it control all reality? Can it move planets? What's the upper limit? It's not like we see anything that spectacular from it in the series, it's just used as a regular dueling wand. No, I think that instead, it's considered the most powerful wand because it's the only one that can do the one most unthinkable thing possible, and that is cut the veil. The barrier between our world and the afterlife. Even just a small piece of it, but that's quite a feat anyway. And cut it did, as I think that a piece of the veil could have ended up becoming the very cloak of invisibility. Makes sense when you consider it's a piece of cloth that not only makes you invisible, but literally protects you from death. Or, dare I say, keeps you separate from death. And in fact, that's exactly what I think happened. The 3 brothers built their Deathly Hallows, inspired by the previous ones we mentioned, to make sure they could finally go through the veil and do what no one else did before. And you know what? I think that they did succeed in doing it. They got the right information, had the right tool to cut a piece of it, and while wearing it as a cloak, they could be the only ones to pass through the veil, using the cloak as a shield or dare I say a barrier against actually dying while you're going through there, and indeed, they did see into the beyond. The first and only people to ever do it. Awesome, right? But it leaves a big, gaping question. What happened? If they went through, why didn't they tell anyone? Why hasn't the secret of the afterlife been revealed for all this time? Why has not only this deed been unrecorded, but even the mere existence of their hollows been erased from memory, existing only as a mere fairy tale? In other words, what the hell did they see that made them not want to tell a single soul? Well, I think I have the answer, and it all goes back to the very first concept that started these videos: the existence of chaos magic. Remember when I said that wizards and witches were actually harnessing it through their spells and wands so that it doesn't go out of control in the real world, and by using magic they sort of comb it to come out in a much more orderly way? Well, I propose that all of reality does this as well. Chaos magic exists in our world, but as we mentioned before, wizards embody it entirely, and most of it dies with them, leaving only a small trace behind. But we didn't say yet where it does go after one's death, and I think the answer is that it follows them all the way to the afterlife. However, it doesn't come out in the same way. I propose that in the same way wizards discovered they could use wands and their own magic to comb chaos magic into a much more controlled and positive one, it turns out, in the grand complexity of all realities, wizards ironically are functioning as wands themselves for all reality, helping chaos magic come out to the other side upon death as orderly magic, a positive one. And I think that the afterlife is exactly that. An infinite, heavenly structure, and it's all held together by this positive magic that was straightened out thanks to the collective deaths of all wizards and witches upon their arrival. And what does this afterlife look like specifically? Well, like whatever brought the most meaning and joy out of the witch or wizard in life. Its shape is affected by the individual, but it all still holds itself intact so long as it's positive. Case in point, when Harry did get killed by Voldemort, to him the afterlife looked like King's Cross Station.
It looks like King's Cross Station, only cleaner and without all the trains.
Positive magic taking the shape of the place with the most positivity and meaning that the person knew in life. Like, say, for example, the promise of a new set of adventures. Proof of this is that it didn't actually look like that for Dumbledore himself when he greeted Harry there.
King's Cross, is that right? We're in King's Cross, you say?
And granted, I know it stated that it's actually limbo, but I don't know. It looks pretty heavenly to me to be just a limbo. Not to mention that, if this really is limbo, since we mentioned Gryffindor's spirit earlier, why didn't we see Gryffindor's spirit there as well? And anyway, all of this is rendered even more true by Dumbledore's wise words of,
"Do not pity the dead, Harry. Pity the living. And above all those who live without love."
Aside from the context of Harry's situation at that moment, why else would he say that? Well, for the same reason the three brothers didn't tell anyone about the afterlife. 'Cause see, in order for the afterlife to maintain this infinite positive structure and exist at all, the positivity must come from the life that a person had. Wizards and witches were already stressed at the idea of having to spend their life harnessing chaos magic or else, and if they knew there was indeed an afterlife of positive energy, they would have been incentivized to just give it all up, to take the fast lane all the way there, most likely through the veil since it would be the most painless way possible. But if they did, they'd forfeit the entire life and all the happy moments they could have had on Earth, the very exact ingredient that the afterlife requires to exist in the first place. Because that's what it actually was all about for magical people. To fight and struggle, yes, but so that they would all be forced to find happiness in other smaller and more humble ways, like love, friendship, kindness, loyalty, protection, and family. Only that can generate the purest forms of positive magic, which would stay in them until they pass away to be delivered into the afterlife. This is why the three brothers chose to never tell anyone the truth and bury all their notions. It was indeed for the greater good. Because without this positive source coming in this way, and if everyone was aware of the truth, they knew they'd be dooming all of reality to collapse in on itself if people didn't go through these experiences first. A tough life, a dangerous life, but a life that would render those smaller moments bigger and more meaningful than they ever could have been otherwise. And to further reiterate the point in the previous video, it's also exactly why it was imperative for Voldemort, someone who couldn't feel love at all, to lose, lest he create an entire society like him, incapable of creating positive magic, only dark magic, and make not only his reality and his timeline collapse, but risk making all of the afterlife's reality crumble in the long run. And in the end, that's exactly what did him in. Losing to a much greater and more positive force that perhaps doesn't immediately exist in our world and can't be seen, but in some ways can at least be in part perceived to be collected as a reward for the end of your life, all thanks to not a metaphorical, but a literal power of love and friendship. The messages were there all along, we just didn't know to what degree yet, and everyone will have quite the surprise after they've lived a full, long, meaningful life.
Phew!
And that, folks, at long last was the world building review of Harry Potter and the Wizarding World. Man, I gotta say, this was a lot more homework than I expected, but then again, it's such a vast and complicated world that it's no surprise. Honestly, I just wasn't expecting so much to already have been accounted for, even if it needed to be tweaked even more. But then again, the rules and world wouldn't be nearly as impactful if it wasn't for the whole picture, especially the events and the memorable characters. Harry Potter is one of those one-of-a-kind franchises that happen in the right way and the right time, and has and will capture the hearts of entire generations. Yeah, it might be a tad bit commercialized by now, and we might even take it for granted at times, but it became so because we all made it so, and really did care for it that much. Even I consider myself lucky to have grown up with these characters almost at the same pace as the films came out, and they gave me a world of happy memories, reliefs, helped me forge lifelong friendships thanks to this shared interest, opened the world of literature for me, were incredibly cathartic, brought so much comfort, and sparked the imagination for years, as I'm sure it happened for all of you as well. It's just too deeply cemented in me and will always remain one of my absolute favorite franchises to cherish deeply, regardless if it's the books, the original movies, the upcoming reboot show, or whatever. And no matter what the future may bring, I will always know that if I ever need to feel at home, Hogwarts' doors will always be there to welcome all. Anyway, that's all for today, folks. What do you think? Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I talking out of my ass? Maybe. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Join my Patreon to support what I do here. And if there's any other franchise whose world building you'd like analyzed, let me know. Until next time, keep building worlds.